So am I surprised? Not even a little bit. In fact, if you go back and watch the video I made prior about Marvel and Sony breaking up over Spider-Man, unable to come to an agreement, I said they probably will, just because there's just too much money involved. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars that they're fighting over, and they can't come to a consensus on who's financing this, who's producing, who's directing, who's getting the rights to the merchandise, bigger cuts of the first day revenue versus ticket sales over time. This is a whole thing. But the one thing we all know, these big corporations love money and they hate uncertainty. So when you have something as certain as Spider-Man and the MCU and you put them together and you make even more money, eventually they were going to figure it out. And the thing about this whole situation is we probably would have never seen any of this happen if they didn't feel they could leverage the public opinion. I believe that the reason we even know that this was going on, because there have been times where we found out years after it's happened, specifically about Spider-Man entering the MCU, that there were times where people were walking out of meetings, throwing sandwiches at each other, and the whole thing looking like it was just never gonna happen, right? Same thing we saw here weeks ago, only for it to happen, and again, here, happen. So the whole thing of us even knowing about this was because Sony or Disney thought that they could leverage the public opinion and pressure the other side into it. So Disney was trying to make Sony look like the bad guy that was keeping Spider-Man out of the MCU, and Sony was doing the same thing to Disney. If I looked at the whole thing, I thought that Disney was probably reaching a bit further than they should, considering it's Sony's property and the MCU needs Spider-Man a whole lot more. Like, it really, really does, especially after Endgame, and they retired several of the Avengers that most of us went to the movies to see in the first place. So, let's take a look here, because Variety did have the scoop on this. They published an article that talked about how they had come to a deal, specifically Sony and Disney and some of their higher-ups, on Thursday night when they signed a deal that's going to have Spider-Man basically be in 2 movies coming up. One will be the third movie, which we need that third movie because of the cliffhanger that was left off on the last Spider-Man movie. Sony would have had to have continued it because it was too interesting. It's too compelling. Most of us were already like, well, we have to see what happens next. We assume that it was probably going to lead into Venom entering the Spider-Man storyline, right, is what we figured, and that's something else we'll talk about here in a minute, because I do think Venom could show up in the MCU now. We'll see. But the other will be an appearance just in a Marvel Universe movie. So in an MCU movie, we'll have Spider-Man show up in a supporting role. But let's take a look at the Variety article as we see here, because they do go over how this deal happened, and they do talk about the terms. So we kind of know what's happening here in terms of who's getting what money, and it seems pretty straightforward to me on this, but let's take a look. They say on Friday, the two companies jointly announced that Marvel Studios and its president, Kevin Feige, will produce the third film in the Spider-Man Homecoming series. It will once again feature Tom Holland, as we expected, since he was going to stay Spider-Man anyway. Even if Sony took if they took Spider-Man and made their own, he was going to stay anyway. So yeah, of course Tom Holland would reprise the role. The rumor mill roared back to life this week with hints that the two companies were close to brokering a new agreement. The rumor mill had been basically churning since they announced that they were breaking up and Spider-Man was leaving the MCU. And that's, again, something that Disney and Sony wanted. They wanted people to talk about this all over the place to try to pressure one side or the other. Over the summer, news broke that the Disney Marvel's parent company and Sony had reached an impasse over a financing deal. Disney wanted the film to be financed on a 50-50 basis, with Feige remaining in a consulting producer capacity. Sony is believed to have proposed keeping the arrangement under the current terms, which stipulated that Marvel receives about 5% of first dollar gross and all merchandising revenues. Now, the deal that they signed is a bit different than that. They say the new deal was signed late on Thursday night. We found out Friday morning. Negotiations involve top players of both studios, which is Tom Rothman, Feige, and then Alan Horn and Alan Bergman. In exchange for lending Feige's producing prowess, Marvel and Disney will receive roughly 25% of the profits. That's according to insiders. So while we don't have the deal like actually out there and confirmed, that's just from, I guess, people who were in the room or had seen the deal, through like the process of it being drafted and agreed upon. Because again, they come to the table several times. There are probably several times that we didn't even hear about them agreeing or meeting about this whole thing. It's amazing to me how public this all went. And how much either side wanted to leverage the other when it came to really just appearance to the public and who was the bad guy in the situation. Disney will retain its merchandising rights and will put up roughly a quarter of the financing. See, Disney gets basically all of the merchandise, like all the money spent. They get it. So that's why it was so weird to me that they were still reaching further, because merchandise sales are ridiculous. Like, I mean, think about how much Spider-Man is all over the place at Christmas time or whenever a new movie comes out, and even during the MCU stuff, Spider-Man is all over the place, super popular. It's insane to me that Disney was reaching that much further, and I kind of get why Sony might have been pushing back on this one. Again, it's Sony's property at this point, and it's Disney who needs it. They need Spider-Man more. The film's scheduled to release on, they already have a date, essentially, July 16th, 2021. So we have a little less than 2 years now, right, for Spider-Man's movie. And then after that, there will be some sort of supporting role. They'll drop him into somebody else's movie, or they'll even do something, the New Avengers or something, and Spider-Man will be a part of it. And here's the thing, I said I wasn't surprised about this at all, and that's because, like I said, there's so much money involved. In fact, this appears, at least to me, to be a temporary deal. It's a deal that's basically going to buy them more time, specifically about 2 years worth of time to close another deal. Now, if the supporting role is after this movie coming up and they still have them, brought into the MCU and they're waiting for that supporting role to come up, they'll probably close a deal before either one of those finish. So if the supporting role comes up first and then this movie is the last thing, they'll probably have an extension essentially drawn up. And I hope they have that planned, because if the extension is signed, I assume Venom will enter, right? I think they'll bring Venom into the MCU, which would be really, really cool. I'd like to see them do some stuff with Carnage. We've obviously seen Mysterio. If you start bringing a lot of these villains, or in some cases allies, depending on where Venom is at the time, you can have some really cool stuff added to the MCU that will help, because, to be honest, looking at the MCU, there's just not a lot that excites me right now after Endgame, because, well, we all know by now, you probably know by now what happened in Endgame, right? There were a lot of characters that most of us went to see, Iron Man, for example, that's not there anymore. Think about Iron Man. He was on front of everything. There were the cups, the posters. Tony Stark was all over the place, right? And then, of course, you lose Captain America. Hulk is retired. Black Widow. You see where we need the star power, right? Spider-Man would fill that role big time. He's the next one up. They made him young on purpose so that he could pretty much lead the MCU going forward, which Disney would have to have a plan in place before. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to make Spider-Man young. They could have made Spider-Man he could have been in his mid to late 20s. He could have been done college and been more experienced, but they made him young on purpose. And I think a lot of that has to do with them wanting to use Spider-Man for quite a while. And he's the perfect anchor for the MCU at this point. And they just got to make sure they're on the same page with Sony going forward, because signing an extension shouldn't be that hard. But the other thing that's interesting about this is when they did break up, I thought more people would be on board with them getting back together and getting Spider-Man back in the MCU. I saw a lot of people who were like, you know what? I think Sony can do it themselves. I don't think they need the MCU. They don't need Marvel. They don't need Disney. And I thought about that, and it's possible, because Spider-Man's already been established, so Sony wouldn't have to go back and do the origin story, and we've seen it like a million times at this point, right? We don't need it to be rebooted again. They weren't going to. They were going to keep Tom Holland, and they were just going to somehow work around all the characters that were introduced during Spider-Man's, basically his origin story being brought in. Somehow they were going to work around that. And I'll be honest, I'm a little interested to know about that script that was being written up by Sony as to what they were going to do with where they were, because I think immediately Venom was coming in. Venom did really well for them. I think he was coming in, and they were maybe even going to bring in Carnage, have Mysterio in there, and maybe pull from some other villains and everything. It would have been pretty interesting just to see how they would have done it. But again, Sony hasn't exactly been creating good Spider-Man movies recently. I mean, they had Spider-Man 2, and that's probably my favorite Spider-Man movie. It's most people will tell you it's the best one, and that's for good reason. So if they could have captured that same magic, then yeah, I would have preferred them to do it. But if it was going to be the Amazing Spider-Man and with Andrew Garfield, if it was something like that, I wouldn't have been that on board with it. At this point, the characters in the MCU I'm interested in seeing interacting with Spider-Man are not really there anymore, so it's tough. Maybe they could bring in Daredevil. Maybe Black Panther could take a bigger role, and then, you know, it could be a bit more interesting. But let me know what you guys think about Sony and Disney making up over billions of dollars. Granted, they're all making a lot of money, okay? That's not the issue here, but Spider-Man will continue to be able to interact in the MCU. He'll have some sort of supporting role, we'll see, and hopefully they don't make him like basically job to some character in the MCU because they know he's going out and he gets like punched through a wall by Captain Marvel or something. But let me know what you guys think about this down below. Make sure to like the video on the way out if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.